My name is Nick Samios. I'm the Director and Fund Manager here at Hermes Capital, and I am your live stream and podcast host. So welcome to you. Today we're going to be talking about the farewell of JobKeeper, and also the sort of slow phasing back or the coming back of wind-up notices. Wind-ups have hit the news in a big way this week, with Citibank acting, I believe, on behalf of Credit Suisse, taking a wind-up action against the Whyalla Steelworks One Steel conglomerate. And I've noticed in the paper that the journalists writing these articles don't really seem to fully understand what a wind-up notice is or how that process works. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about that. And we would then also use that scenario. We're not going to discuss that scenario, but we're going to use that scenario as a bit of a roadmap for talking about what you should do when someone sticks a wind-up notice on one of your clients, and how you maybe should react to that if you're a bank, a supplier, employees, what you should be thinking. We're also going to talk about the end of JobKeeper. Now, I've got, if we just put up slide 14, I saw this wonderful obituary by one of the friends of Lunch Money, Louisa Shijabat. She wrote this obit to JobKeeper: "Farewell JobKeeper, born 30th of March 2020, to be buried April 2021. In your short life, you tried your best to help those most in need. After a quick conception, you were a very welcomed and much loved member of the rescue package family," etc., etc., etc. A memorial service will be held at the Australian Tax Office towards the end of April. Like everything else about you, accountants have the details. So that was a wonderful obit there by Louisa. So I just thought I would share that with you to set the tone a little bit for when we get to talk about JobKeeper. Now, before I introduce our first guest today, I would like to remind you to share, like, or subscribe to our podcast or our live stream. Hit the notification button if you're on YouTube, and that way you won't miss a single episode. And we're on all the podcasting platforms, so you can listen to us while you're driving to and from your next restructuring engagement, if you like. Okay, listen, without further ado, I will introduce our first guest for today, and that is David Mansfield.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
Not too bad. How are you?
I'm good.
Now, David Mansfield is a restructuring partner at Deloitte, Australia. He's been there for some time. He was also at Moore Stephens before that. Moore Stephens in Parramatta?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
So my connection to David actually goes back more than probably any other person that I've ever dealt with in my life. David and I actually knew each other when we were about 5 or 6, I dare say.
Primary school, that's right.
Indeed. David was a year behind me, but I've known you, David, longer than I've known probably anybody else that I speak with today, including probably my younger brother. So there you go. Now, David, tell me, what is it that's been keeping this Deloitte partner busy this week?
Well, I think a lot of the inquiries we're getting at the moment are people trying to be proactive. So whether they're clients of the business service area of Deloitte, they've got probably coming off JobKeeper, they might be looking at issues around, particularly around maybe tax debt. So we're seeing quite a few inquiries about that. Companies that have built up tax debt during the JobKeeper process, and they're now wanting to make payment arrangements with the tax office. So they're asking for our help on that. So I guess that's people being proactive around that. We're certainly getting inquiries about other advisory sort of work as well. I mean, formal insolvency work hasn't really started to flow yet, but the sort of things that we have been working on that space is we've had a couple of personal insolvency agreements where people have wanted to take advantage that they think in this market creditors are going to be receptive to proposals put forward. So we've had a few of those. And we're certainly getting inquiries about voluntary administrations with the same sort of thinking that creditors want to, the directors want to go to creditors early if they think they're going to put a proposal up to them. They think by going early, they may have a better chance of success than going in subsequent months.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. I mean, you've raised a couple of points there. Firstly, you are seeing people being proactive. I mean, I speak to insolvency people, and they're not necessarily getting a lot of even preemptive phone calls at this stage still, but you are seeing people that are acting sort of anticipating for their own businesses, or are they worried about their customers?
Oh no, it's professional service firms that are referring clients to us. So it's for their clients. But and look, it's not widespread, but we are certainly getting people coming to us on that basis. And I think, they've had a bit of time to think about this because, it's not like the GFC where things happen very quickly. That we've had months for businesses to sort of think about what happens when JobKeeper ends.
And that's right. Well, yeah. I mean, we've had months to think about when it ends. Yeah, but I guess yeah. So, and you mentioned also tax debt. So there's a bit of planning on the tax side as well.
Yeah, well, there's certainly been some businesses that have built up a large tax debt. And some of that would be superannuation as well, a lump in there. So particularly, businesses that even if they had JobKeeper support to pay wages, they didn't necessarily pay the superannuation. So they're often sitting on a combined liability of the tax office for superannuation and PAYG and GST, mainly PAYG.
And of course, a lot of people wouldn't have paid their tax debt paid the tax office in 12 months. I was talking to some people in your trade who are complaining that whereas under normal circumstances they could get an insolvency matter where there's not necessarily any assets to cover their fees, but the good old ATO has maybe received some preferential payments. But if they haven't been paid a nickel in the last 6 months, there's nothing to claw back, is there?
Oh, that's absolutely the case. You're right.
Yeah, and
I might add a lot of them haven't been paying. Some of those struggling businesses probably haven't been paying suppliers other than absolutely ones they need for continued services.
And so is this something, because I know that you deal sort of up and down, being Deloitte, obviously you see some pretty big stuff, but you also you're also in the SME space as well. So are the conversations you're having different depending on where you sort of sit on the food chain?
Well, yeah. So because there's probably a range of businesses, and I guess the management structure might be more sophisticated. I mean, at the SME. I'm in the SME mid-market space. At the SME level, the directors are not quite so sophisticated, so that's quite a different discussion. You're probably doing an education piece about insolvency laws and what their options are. At the other end, you've usually got sophisticated management team and directors, and that they usually pick up things quicker, and they're probably more open to more innovative solutions.
Okay. All right. Well, look, I think we'll put you back into the waiting room, and I'll introduce our next guest. Thank you, David. And our next guest is Darren Anderson. G'day, Darren. How are you?
G'day, Nick. I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Very, very good indeed. Very good indeed. What have you been busy doing this week? I should say Darren Anderson is a managing partner at ERA Legal, and Darren is a specialist in insolvency and workouts, but he's also carving out a bit of a sort of a leading role in working for non-bank lenders as well. I guess you just seem to be doing more and more in that mortgage space.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that has been keeping me busy over the last couple of weeks, is that the private lending market really seems to be coming back to life. I think I've said once before, in the 12 months pre-COVID, we settled around about $1 billion in private lending transactions, and in the first 6 months of COVID, we settled $50 million. So it was a big drop at the start of COVID. It started to come back in about September last year, and I think we're getting back to where we were pre-COVID. I also have spent the last 10 days or so on and off aeroplanes, and up until about 10 days ago, I had not been on an aircraft for a year and 20 days, which was quite remarkable. So I've been to Adelaide, been to Melbourne a couple of times, and been to the Gold Coast. And it's great to be able to get back and see people in other states. And I've been out a lot in the last week or so talking to clients. I think the vibe around town has really improved. Everyone is a lot more upbeat, certainly in my space, which is in the insolvency and the private lending space. So that's what we've been up to.
David made a comment that he was seeing a bit of personal insolvency work, but also sort of the potential VA stuff where people are looking to take action now because they think that creditors might be a little bit more lenient right now. What's your feeling there? If people are looking to restructure either their businesses or their personal affairs, do you think people are going to be a little bit more lenient now than they might be, in the future?
I think there's definitely people who are now coming out of the woodwork and starting looking at restructuring their businesses and restructuring their personal affairs. It's a shame they didn't do it over the last 12 months when we really had the best opportunities to do personal restructures and corporate insolvency restructures, but they're certainly increasing, and you just have to have a look at the wind-up list to see the number of wind-ups that have increased over the last few weeks.
Yeah, okay. But when you're talking, because I know obviously you do debt recovery as well, I mean, are people, looking for revenge, or are they just looking to get for whatever they can get, sort of thing?
I haven't found anyone looking for revenge. I don't think. I think everyone's been pretty fair to each other in terms of the recovery processes. I think I expected there'd be a much bigger flood of stat demands and people resurrecting their enforcement processes, but I haven't seen that much yet. But I think it'll start to play its way out over the next 2 or 3 months, and I think people who are involved in debt recovery are going to become very busy. And I just wonder how the courts are going to cope.
Well, I have to say, Darren, I mean, you right at the very beginning of this COVID stuff, you of all people said, listen, the work's not going to come back for a long time. Everybody was saying, the end of the year, whenever. I mean, you've always been, I guess, a little bit of a restructuring bear, and you've always said it was going to be later rather than sooner. And you've been proven absolutely spot on.
I'm still waiting for the GFC flood of work to come.
Right. Okay. But you are saying though you do think that things will pick up shortly for restructuring.
I think that in terms of picking up, certainly the private lending market has picked up. I think that's going to be quite fluid. Yeah. And insolvencies will have to pick up because there's a lot of zombie businesses out there, and they're going to have to topple over at some point.
All right. Yeah. Well, we'll just hold that thought. We'll bring David back. And if we could just pull up slide 5 as a bit of a talking point, we'll sort of pick up exactly where Darren's left us off. And you can see here notifications of company entering external administration or controller appointments compared with the same week last year. So if you're listening on our podcast, no surprise that we've got a blue line for 2020. And it seems to be, roughly 150 to 200 appointments a week. And you compare that to a red line for FY 2021, and the appointments are still at running anywhere up to sort of a 50% of last year. So that's more or less, that's really what you're talking about there, Darren, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah. And then if we go to the next slide after that, which is the wind-up notices. I mean, we've just got a slide here showing that in January there was, a little over 20 wind-up notices. In February, we're sort of pushing towards 40. In March, it's really taken off. It's closer to 160. But it's still not the highest of levels. But those numbers, I mean, that's a substantial increase on what they've been. I wonder why is it that they leapt up so much in March, do you think, David?
Well, if they were compulsory winding up, so I guess, the process for lodging, filing statutory demands and that working through the system, that will contribute in part to it. But I think, presumably the number of CVLs go into that as well. I think it's probably just that seasonality that people come back in January. It probably takes them a little while to get to see an advisor, and that probably starts ramping up in February and March. And if you looked on that previous graph, although the numbers were down, it sort of followed that cyclical curve for after the ramp up for the beginning of the year. So I think it reflects that.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, look, we'll move on to our next slide, which is David. I mean, as you know, we here are the social media home for workouts and restructuring people, and so we're actively monitoring the social media feeds of people like yourself. And you published some Deloitte. Deloitte presented some data very nicely, and if we could just show the first one, it's basically looking at the impact of JobKeeper around the country. So starting off with this first slide, which shows Australia, just talk us through what's going on there.
Well, I guess the green columns that you can see, and if we look at that, the chart immediately under the map of the country, that's the national average for JobKeeper. But you can see that for the months from October through to March, it's the amount of businesses that were on JobKeeper as it declines over a period of time. And you can see the first 4 months, then it drops down as JobKeeper 2 really starts, and then it plateaus out to when it eventually stopped. But you can see the graphs on the far right-hand side that show state by state, and perhaps not surprisingly, the states that had periods of a lockdown that affected their economies, they're probably the ones that relied on it the most. So if you see Victoria, that the amount of businesses on JobKeeper declined by only 47% from its peak or its start to the end. So that shows at the end there were still quite a lot of businesses on JobKeeper, and you can see also New South Wales was probably the second most state, 61%. The other states, Tasmania, WA, and South Australia, they really didn't experience the lockdowns of the other states.
Right.
So that's what that reflects.
Right. So we've just, again, for the listeners, we've got these charts, and you can find these graphs on David's LinkedIn feed if you look him up on LinkedIn. But we're basically seeing that in WA, South Australia, and Tasmania, 70% of the companies that were originally on JobKeeper dropped off by the end of JobKeeper, whereas, as David just said, New South Wales, 60% have come off, Victoria only 47%, Queensland 67%. What are your thoughts on that, Darren? You've been travelling the country?
Yeah, well, I think the JobKeeper, the thing about the JobKeeper is people are going to miss the free cash coming into their business. So I don't know how they're really going to cope. There's a lot of businesses that have been propped up primarily by JobKeeper throughout the entire period. So I just can't see how we're not going to get a whole influx of CVLs when people realise that there's no free cash flow in their business. I just can't see how.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've certainly spoken to people that said open. Yeah. But on the other, I know. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Yet when you talk to people like David, then it's not like their phones are ringing off the hook with this just yet. Just if we go to the next slide. Actually, we'll skip over the next slide. Go to slide.
I do hear, Nick, there are a lot of inquiries from insolvency practitioners I talk to. There's always talk over the last couple of months about them receiving a lot more inquiry.
Right.
Yeah? Not necessarily converting into jobs, but obviously over time the inquiry will convert into jobs.
Yeah.
And, in that sector where we work, a lot of that activity is the directors rarely take that initiative themselves. They're usually pushed. So, it's a recovery action by the ATO principally, or the Office of State Revenue, that drives them to take some sort of action, or banks. And none of those as a group are really pressing for payment. So I think that's why directors have got this sort of window period where they've got time to think about things.
Okay. Well, look, if we just skip to slide 9 now, and we're not going to sort of do a detailed state by state, but we'll just by way of example, we'll just have a quick look at New South Wales here. Again, it's got the graph there of the total states, 60% off. Obviously, it's the urban areas that are very heavily concentrated, aren't they? You've got it's a bit of a weather map here. You've got the rain clouds there showing that, which parts of regional New South Wales, for example. I mean, what is that data telling you, David?
I think the takeaway from it is that the regional areas that had non-tourist related businesses, they've come back pretty strongly. I think urban areas, and in New South Wales, it's probably areas like the top 5: or Lakemba, Campsie, Hurstville, Carlton. These are areas that have businesses that are, on JobKeeper and that they've been the slowest to come back. And, that probably reflects in part, the lockdown that New South Wales experienced. It's probably also, that hospitality sector and services sector in New South Wales and Sydney is very strong, and that's been badly hit by that. And it hasn't bounced back. You can see it in urban centres around Sydney. There's still a lot of businesses that are actually closed down.
All right, well, let's just have a look at Victoria.
And again, very similar, except, of course, there's a lot more businesses on JobKeeper across the state, but particularly in urban areas. So it's still that area, still the state that had most businesses on JobKeeper. So, and again, the regional areas, non-tourist related, they're the ones that have bounced back pretty quickly.
And Queensland, which is the next slide.
Yeah, so Queensland, the areas that are badly affected are the regional areas are the far north Queensland that rely on tourism, which is perhaps not surprising. Coincidentally, I was up in Cairns a week ago and in Port Douglas, and there are a lot of businesses that have just closed down. So they've already closed down and exited. A lot of the hospitality businesses that you spoke to, they were on their, they were saying that they're on their last legs. They really need to have a really strong period of domestic tourism to try and keep them afloat. They were just going into the school holidays, so that would be good, but they've got to have that momentum carry for quite a few months to come. And again, the other areas that are badly affected are those metropolitan areas.
Any thoughts there, Darren? I know that you get to Queensland a fair bit.
Yeah, I think the problem with places like Port Douglas and the businesses closing, it really lowers the appeal of the town. If who wants to go to a town that doesn't have any restaurants or is a bit of a ghost town? But hopefully it'll bounce back, particularly given that they are going in to their peak season. Cairns, Port Douglas, winter is their peak season. So hopefully we avoid another lockdown. Or we don't get locked out of Queensland by the Queensland Premier. And people can get up to places like Cairns and Port Douglas and start spending some money.
Yep.
So I was just going to add, the other part about that is the cost of accommodation, rental cars. That's actually still quite high up there. In fact, that there's been an element of like the Airbnb accommodation up there, because there was very few people travelling up there. Those businesses, a lot of those operators have pulled their accommodation and they've gone to permanent rentals. So you haven't got that level of accommodation. So there is, in effect, less accommodation. So if the tourism numbers pick up, there will be high rates for accommodation.
And I don't think that people who can afford to travel, people who are lucky, like probably the three of us on this panel who can afford to travel, really don't mind paying the full rate for accommodation and paying the full rate or a little bit more for restaurant bills, because we know how hard those businesses have suffered. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, particularly if you take along some of our mutual friends, Darren, and they start ordering the wine, they're certainly not frightened to spend when you and I are shouting. That's for sure. Listen, just a very quick look at WA. So same sort of story there, and then again, I guess interesting, Subiaco, Osborne Park, Nedlands, but again, WA overall is 72% off, so it's not quite the story that the other states are. If we could just flick back to slide 8, this is perhaps a more another representation there of companies entering XAD. So that's more or less the same story as that previous slide. Any further thoughts on that one, David?
Oh, well, I think, look, what this shows is there's the to your graph that you showed, there is this there's this vast number of companies that didn't go into liquidation that should have in a normal business cycle. So on that graph, the light green bar in the middle of that graph, that really shows that flow of insolvencies coming through. That's why we refer to it this wave of insolvencies. Just for the normal flow of insolvencies that we would have had other than COVID, that will produce that light green bar. Then we're saying, and then there's another line above that, we're saying on top of that, you're going to have a volume of COVID-induced insolvencies as well. So that's why we're saying there is this build-up of insolvencies that will have to come through the system at some stage.
Well, just hold that slide there, my producers. So really, that is the wave. You've done a diagram of the wave there. I mean, I've been saying that when you look at the insolvency figures, 2020 owes 2021. An awful lot of insolvencies that didn't happen, and they can't have just been. If the numbers halved, you'd expect they're going to happen at some stage. Is that what that graph's telling us?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think about that, Darren?
There's going to be a lot of insolvencies where nobody is going to be able to make any return out of it, if I can be cynical, because there's going to be a lot of business that's going to have to be wound up and shut down, where there's absolutely no assets to sell, and there's no point in pursuing anyone for voidable transactions or insolvent trading, because those people, even if you did have an insolvent trading claim, won't have any resources to meet it. So whilst there's going to be a flood of insolvencies, a very large percentage of those insolvencies are going to be dead jobs. Yeah. Like, who would want to become a liquidator of a cafe in Melbourne? Yeah, what have you got to sell? You've got nothing.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Darren. I've noticed, I can't remember if it's in my Facebook or somewhere, there's this stream of people spruiking investment courses, how to buy a business for no money down. It's like the property spruikers. Now they're spruiking businesses. And I'm thinking, how are they doing that? Maybe it's these cafes. And David, thank you very much for allowing us to use those slides. And I'll just remind our viewers and listeners that they can just go to your LinkedIn feed and or reach out to you via LinkedIn. Great, I'll put those details when we do the show brief. Now we're just going to have a look at something else that was in the news this week. Now, we had Whyalla Steelworks had a wind-up notice stuck on it by Citibank, who I think were acting for Credit Suisse. Now, I am not across any of the details. I don't think any of us here are across the details. So the conversation we're about to have is strictly generic. We're not talking about Whyalla Steelworks. We're not talking about Citibank or Credit Suisse. But it does raise some interesting questions. As I said, when I saw the media coverage of it, they didn't really quite understand the wind-up process. So I've drawn this hypothetical unsecured creditors here carrying briefcases who have initiated wind-up action. So just very briefly, given that most of our audience sort of knows what we're talking about, but some of it doesn't, Darren, do you just want to sort of dumb down for us what exactly that means?
In the current context, I think it's a traditional wind-up notice where you serve a stat demand. This is direct to court on a basis of proving insolvency. But why are the unsecured creditors spending their money to wind up companies? If that's the question, I really don't know. Particularly where there are substantial institutional creditors which will rank ahead of them, particularly, for example, the Commonwealth Government, when Fed comes in play, there's substantial secured creditors in front of them. So really, unsecured creditors, what the end game is really hard to understand, particularly given that there are significant fees and cost involved in pursuing a winding up application in the court. Often it is done by unsecured creditors in order to get some ransom money out of the creditors. So file a wind up and hope you get paid out. The wind up dismissed. But in this instance, it's obviously a much bigger play.
I think I'm on safe territory without sort of upsetting anybody to say that, that there has been a bit of a red rag to the bull in this situation where Gupta publicly said, I'm not paying, So when I heard that, Darren, just under what circumstances, just again speaking generically, under what circumstances can you not pay a debt? I mean, I'm thinking there's two circumstances. Either you're insolvent or the debt's not doesn't exist. So if there's no debt, then you don't have to pay it. And I think that in this specific case, Gupta's saying, well, I've got a 3-year agreement. There's a lot of technical stuff that we don't know about. So we're not talking about this case. Yeah.
Or is the owner of the business in the theoretical sense playing the too big to fail card?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, again, for our listeners, what I've got here, I've drawn a picture of all the stakeholders. So I've got a theoretical client sitting in the middle of it. I've got a bank, I've got suppliers, I've got employees, I've got the government, and I've got these other unsecured creditors that we've just talked about. So we've just said really that in this scenario, we think we're not exactly sure what's motivating them. There might be a ransom scenario, as Darren just said. It could be, as I just said, it could be a bit of a red rag to a bull situation. I mean, speaking generally, David, I mean, when you become the administrator or the liquidator of a business, you find yourself having to collect debts. What happens if you start chasing people for money for the company that you're suddenly in control of, and they say, I'm not going to pay?
Well, I might just comment on that. The other reason that might be driving some of the activity from people wanting to wind up companies, and that's often if they've got debtor insurance, they've actually got to take that step to put the company into liquidation before they can claim on the insurance. So that's sometimes an issue that drives. Otherwise, you question why companies are being wound up, but for where they know there's no chance of getting paid. But that often drive that activity. So if we're appointed to a company and we've got to recover debts and they don't pay, then we've got to make a commercial decision as to whether it's worth further legal action. And that'll probably go to the issue of the size of the debt. Litigation is expensive. Is it in dispute? Do we think the debtor's got the ability to pay, and/or did the company have debtor insurance that we can claim on? But do we have to take it to a certain stage before we can claim the debtor insurance?
Okay.
So
all right. Look, what we're going to do is thank you for that. Yeah, well, the debtor insurance is a very interesting angle, and particularly in this specific case, is that there is insurance. But let's. What I want to do is just quickly go around this wheel because we are running out of time a little bit. So I'm going to ask you both. So we've talked about the unsecured creditors who are taking the action. Let's now just flip to the other side of that. Now, I in this particular case, I was listening to ABC News the other day, and they were interviewing various suppliers and subcontractors and employees, and they all said that they were really busy, they were getting lots of work. But again, just sort of talking generically, if one of your clients approaches you, David, or you, Darren, and says, look, I'm a little bit worried, my biggest customer has just had a wind-up notice put on them by somebody else, what should I do? I mean, what's your general advice there, David, in a normal situation? Or not talking about this scenario specifically.
So it's a customer of the business, so it provides services and goods to the business.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. You're someone who is a supplier. They've come to you and said, "Look, I'm a bit worried. Someone else has stuck a wind-up notice. Should I keep supplying?"
Well, yes, they should. Well, they've got to make that decision. They want to secure that they're going to get paid for the goods they're supplying. So they may want to make sure they're getting COD, or they're getting some sort of additional security in place to cover that, whether it's personal guarantee or something else. But what we have seen even in our practice, like amongst business service clients, businesses are looking at their supply chain, and if there's critical suppliers that they in part of their supply chain, they are looking to see, is that company able to be a continual viable business, and do they need support from them if they think they're in financial hardship, and how can they help them to continue in business?
Darren, what are your thoughts? Because you certainly can't take security all of a sudden, can you?
Well, you can take security. I agree with David's comments. You can take security. I'd grab as much security as I can. Now, it may be that security is subject to some form of challenge down the track if the company goes into liquidation. But you can take some third-party security, but it's much better to grab the security and have it, and have someone attack it than not have it at all. So I'd be grabbing the security. I'd definitely be going COD immediately, and I'd be having a chat and reviewing what the collections team has been doing within the business to limit the exposure to a preferential payment claim by a future liquidator.
Okay, and we've got a question here about whether or not that would cause a clawback under a preferential clawback from
I think
our
if
viewer
you got
Mark.
security, if you took security from the company at a time when it was insolvent, that security interest would be challenged. But as I say, it's better to take it than not have it and let someone attempt to challenge it. But I think what David was getting at was looking at third-party security, so taking security from the directors or from another third party. But I think David's also right. You've got to continue to supply as long as you get paid for those supplies as you make them. Because if you're a critical supplier and you don't supply, well, then the business is finished.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the scenarios here. Okay. Well, let's move on to the bank. Now, again, we're not talking about this scenario specifically, but just imagine that there is a scenario where there is a secured creditor. The bank's holding all the security, obviously, and all of a sudden someone's stuck a wind-up notice in. Now, I know that certainly in my case, I'm on the phone with the client, just making sure that it's being dealt with accordingly. But David, you obviously act for all the major banks at various times. A scenario where one of the unsecured suddenly slips in a wind-up notice wouldn't be an unusual one for you?
No, look, it'd be very rare for a bank to be unaware of a winding-up petition against a company that's on their watch list and for it to go and slip into liquidation without them knowing. Most of the banks would have some idea about that coming. And I think that they would review their position and see what options are available to them. Just because there's winding-up petition on foot doesn't mean there's an act of default. So they may not necessarily be able to appoint a receiver immediately anyway, even if they wanted to. The banks have, generally been willing to work with insolvency practitioners after they've been appointed. They probably want to see who's been nominated, see if it's somebody that they think that they could work with. And they'd also want to assess their position, whether they think the company going into liquidation is going to, compromise the position of the company. If there's leases on foot or it's going to trigger unintended consequences that they may not want it to go into liquidation. That may be the trigger for a receiver being appointed.
Darren, anything to add to that?
I can't really speak for the banks because for the top tier banks as to what is in their mind, because often they're difficult to work out. But in the private lending market, if I had a private lender which was a secured creditor, the first thing you do is assess what their security position is, and the snap appointment of a receiver isn't necessarily always the right move, because with the appointment of a receiver or taking control of security, you can actually incur significant liabilities on behalf of the secured creditor. You're looking at if it's land, for argument's sake, you're looking at having to pay land taxes and statutory charges.
Right.
Insuring the property, making sure everything is secure. So there are a number of things that come into play, and sometimes it might be the case just to allow, as David said, allow the liquidator, if you can work with the liquidator, do the job for you.
Yeah, I guess. I think that's also sometimes in these scenarios, the unsecureds taking the wind-up action. Sometimes I felt as though someone's trying to hold a gun at my head as a secured creditor as well. The bank might be thinking, well, we better write a check to make these people go away. All right, just moving on then to we've talked about the unsecureds, the other suppliers of the bank. What about the employees? Darren, I know that your firm certainly does a little bit of work in the FEG space. I mean, what would FEG be thinking does it suddenly come on their radar because there's a wind-up? Certainly, obviously, the steelwork situation's been in the news, so I'd find it hard to believe that FEG wouldn't be giving, wouldn't have this sitting on someone's desk.
Yeah. For the employees, FEG is great for the employees if they lose their job.
Right.
But the employees really don't want to lose their job. The employees want to keep their job. So, as a last resort, FEG is great for the employees. If the employees do lose their job and FEG has to come into play, well, FEG's really playing quite an aggressive role now, which is not necessarily a bad thing in holding liquidators and secure creditors to account in terms of what they do in relation to winding up businesses.
Well, they've become the de facto regulators, if you ask me. But that's really what they've done. All right, look, we are sort of winding on the clock, so I just thought we'd finally come to the other stakeholder, is the government. Now, again, in this particular scenario, there's 5,000 or 6,000 jobs, and obviously, particularly South Australia, doesn't want to see those jobs go. I mean, nobody wants to see those jobs go, and so everybody turns to the government and says, what are you going to do about it? And there's talk. I think we've got one of the headlines actually. If we go to slide 3, just briefly, we've got. South Australia mulls bridging loan for Sanjeev Gupta's Whyalla Steelworks. Now, I wonder who's going to get that loan. Does it go to Sanjeev, or if he's got if he's got someone winding him up? I just wonder would the government then be bailing out the employees, or would they be in fact bailing out Credit Suisse in this particular scenario? And then we've also got Canberra Mulls Whyalla Steelworks rescue plan. So we've got the state government and the federal government looking at, obviously they're thinking about trying to save those jobs, and I think there might be an election coming up in South Australia. Is that right, Darren?
I'm not sure about this election coming in South Australia, but there's certainly an election coming up federally. Right. Before the end of the year, in my view. But my question always is, in a capitalist system, why are governments bailing out private businesses? Private business doesn't want the government involved in their businesses when times are good, but people want big government to bail out businesses when it suits them. So I don't understand why the government would be bailing out this particular business.
Well, I know myself that when I'm looking at a restructuring scenario, I ask myself the question, am I rescuing the bank or am I rescuing the client? I mean, it's one thing to rescue the client. Obviously, as I say, you want to save the business and save the jobs. But usually in order to be able to provide the business with some extra cash flow, you've got to deal with the incumbent lenders. Now, if it's someone who's got a wind-up action, you obviously don't want to lend to a business and then they get wound up, so you need to deal with that. And if there's a bank that might be taking precipitous action as well, you don't want to be, you may have to pay them out in order to get your hands on security. So my question is, how do you make sure that you're bailing out the customer and not bailing out their creditors?
I think the question is always got to be, Nick, if you were looking at it to refinance it, you're not going to want to refinance a business for 3 months. You're going to want to refinance it and have it as a client of yours for long term. So the first thing you're going to look at is whether it's a viable business.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. I mean, I've always said that we've got two criteria, and one of those criteria is, is it a viable business? I mean, is there enough runway to make sure that, as I say, we're not just bailing out everybody, but that the company is being rescued. Any thoughts yourself there, David?
Oh, look, I won't talk to that, but what I will say about the federal government and FEG for that matter as well. Federal government agencies, there are signs where they're taking an all-of-government approach to a matter. So we've had voluntary administrations where there's been a proposal put up, tax officers, major creditor. FEG could potentially be a major creditor if the business closed down. That would trigger a lot of payments that they'd have to be paid out. And so in that case, the tax office voted for the proposal because they could see the total amount that the federal government would have to pay out would have been a lot more than what they would have got as a return on the liquidation or administration. So, and I've seen that as well with other federal government agencies where they've taken this all-of-government view. So I think that is a pleasing development. Okay. Because they have traditionally always been that way.
All right. Well, look, we've actually run overtime a little bit, so I think we'll draw the line there. Thank you very much to Daren Anderson, the managing partner at ERA Legal, and thank you, David Mansfield, Deloitte restructuring partner. Any closing comments, guys, just before we wrap up and say goodbye? I'll start with you, David.
Oh, look, I think the next 6 months will be very telling. I think insolvencies will increase, albeit I think it's going to be slow. But I think there's clearly an indication that a lot of people are wanting to take proactive action and try and see if they can do informal arrangements. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that activity.
That's interesting. Informal arrangements. Okay, Darren, your closing thoughts?
My closing comment to people is get out and spend some money over the weekend if you can afford to do so. Those businesses, particularly hospitality and tourism businesses, that have suffered so much, get out when you can and spend some money and help those businesses get back on their feet.
Okay, very good. All right, well, there you go, a rallying cry from Darren there. All right, well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us today. It's been very interesting, so that's why we've run over time. Thank you very much to our live stream viewers and listeners, and thank you to everybody who's downloaded our podcast. And we'll do it all again next week. Thank you very much, and goodbye. Cheers.